1960s and early 1970s, a serial killer who terrorized Northern California was known as the Zodiac Killer. The killer murdered 5 couples and 1 person and tried to draw attention to the case by sending cryptic messages to his victims' families and the police. Murders. The first victims of the Zodiac Killer were Deborah Jean Hartnell and Michael Renaud Majot, murdered in Vallejo on December 20th, 1968. Hartnell was stabbed to death and Majot was shot and wounded. The second murders took place in Lake Berryessa on July 4th, 1969. In these murders, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were killed. Faraday was shot dead and Jensen was stabbed to death. The third murders took place on July 29th, 1969, also in Lake Berryessa. In these murders, Cecilia Ann Shepard and Brian Hartnell were killed. Hartnell was stabbed to death. Shepard was stabbed and shot in the head. The fourth and final murders took place in San Francisco on October 11th, 1969. In these murders, Paul Lee Stein was killed. Stein was shot to death. Coded messages. After his murders, the Zodiac Killer tried to draw attention to the case by sending cryptic messages to local newspapers. One of these messages was a 340-character code that could not be deciphered. Other messages, while more easily deciphered, do not provide any clues about the killer's identity or motivations. Research. There have been many investigations into the identity and motivations of the Zodiac Killer, but none have been successful. Many theories have been put forward about the killer's identity. Some of these theories are as follows. Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was arrested as the Zodiac Killer in 1969, but was later released. Although there is some evidence that Allen is guilty, this evidence is not conclusive. Lawrence Kane. Kane was arrested as the Zodiac Killer in 1971, but was later released. There is no evidence that Kane is guilty. Richard Gaikowski. Gaikowski was arrested as the Zodiac Killer in 1991, but was later released. While there is some evidence that Gaikowski is guilty, this evidence is not conclusive. The Zodiac Killer's motivations are still a mystery. It has been claimed that the killer felt guilt, wanted attention, or wanted to send a political message. Impact of the killings. The Zodiac murders have deeply affected the United States. The killings created fear and anxiety among the public. It also affected efforts to profile and catch serial killers. The Zodiac Killer is one of the most mysterious serial killers in the history of the United States. The killer's identity and motivations are still unknown. These murders remain one of the most famous unsolved murders. In the late 1960s, people living in the San Francisco Bay Area were threatened by a serial killer who terrorized them. This killer was known as the Zodiac Killer and often targeted his victims in pairs. After killing his victims, the Zodiac Killer would send coded messages to local newspapers to draw attention to the case. These messages showed that the killer was both intelligent and dangerous. The police worked hard to catch the Zodiac Killer, but without success. The killer's identity and motivations are still unknown. One night, a young couple, John and Mary, decided to go camping on a lake outside San Francisco. It would be their first camping experience, and they were both very excited. Later that night, John and Mary sat around the campfire watching the stars. The weather was beautiful, and everything was going well. Suddenly, however, John saw a shadow by the campfire. The shadow was shining in the light of the campfire, and a fear gripped John. John called out to Mary, but she did not hear him. John stood up and started walking towards the shadow. When the shadow noticed John approaching, it started to move around the campfire. John followed the shadow, and the shadow pulled John behind a tree. When John looked behind the tree, he came face to face with the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer pointed a pistol at John and fired. John felt the bullet hit him in the stomach, and he collapsed. The Zodiac Killer came over to John and began stabbing him. When Mary heard John's screams, she started to walk around the campfire. Mary saw John lying bleeding from the Zodiac killer's head. Mary yelled at the Zodiac killer, but the Zodiac killer ignored her. After the Zodiac killer killed John, he walked away. Mary ran to John and embraced him. John was dying and told Mary to forgive him. Mary was in love with John and said she would never forgive him. John gave Mary one last kiss and died. Mary sat by the campfire with John's body and waited for morning. When morning came, the police arrived and took Mary to the hospital. While in the hospital, Mary watched the news about the Zodiac killer. The Zodiac killer claimed to have committed more murders, and the police worked hard to catch him. However, the Zodiac killer was never caught, and the fear in the San Francisco Bay Area continued for many years. While in the hospital, Mary watched the news about the Zodiac killer. The Zodiac killer claimed to have committed more murders, and the police worked hard to catch him. However, the Zodiac killer was never caught, and the fear in the San Francisco Bay Area continued for many years. After Mary was released from the hospital, she decided to dedicate her life to finding the Zodiac killer. Mary did everything she could to uncover the identity of the Zodiac killer, but without success. Mary died in 2023, having given up hope of finding the identity of the Zodiac killer. Mary's story is an example of the horrific actions of the Zodiac killer. This serial killer has ruined the lives of many, and his identity is still unknown. The identity and motivations of the Zodiac killer remain an unsolved mystery. However, Mary's story will continue to serve as a reminder of the suffering of this mysterious killer's victims and the pain he has left their families. This ending makes the story even more tragic and thought-provoking. Mary has dedicated her life to finding out the identity of the Zodiac killer, but without success. This suggests that the Zodiac killer's identity and motivations are indeed an unsolvable mystery. After Mary was released from the hospital, she set to work to find the Zodiac killer. First, she wrote letters to local newspapers and television stations describing the murders. In these letters, she asked for help from anyone who had seen the Zodiac killer or had any information about him. Mary also worked to decode the Zodiac killer's coded messages. Decoding these messages could help reveal the identity of the killer. Mary enlisted the help of many experts to decode the encrypted messages, but without success. Mary traveled across the country to find the Zodiac killer. She interviewed the families and friends of the killer's victims and learned everything about the Zodiac killer. As a result of her research, Mary found important information about the Zodiac killer. In 2023, Mary believed she knew the identity of the Zodiac killer. However, she did not share this information with anyone. Mary only wanted to use this information to catch the Zodiac killer. Mary died in 2023 at the age of 75. Before she died, Mary revealed the identity of the Zodiac killer in a letter. This letter was found by Zodiac killer investigators after Mary's death. In the letter, Mary revealed the identity of the Zodiac killer. According to Mary, the Zodiac killer was John Smith, a retired police officer who was living at the time. The letter was carefully analyzed by Zodiac killer researchers. The researchers thought that Mary's claims might be true. However, it was not possible to prove the claims conclusively. The identity of the Zodiac killer remains a mystery. However, Mary's story will continue to remind us of the suffering of the victims of this mysterious killer and the pain he has left in their families. This ending makes the story even more exciting and thought-provoking. Mary has finally managed to discover the identity of the Zodiac killer, but what does she do with this knowledge? Did Mary use this information to catch the Zodiac killer, or did she keep this information to herself? The answer to these questions could be important for understanding the identity of the Zodiac killer and the motivations of this mysterious killer.